Hey there, everyone. It's Garrick here again, and I'm bringing to you our next session with our friend Bryce Howitson here, and he's going to be giving us Chrome DevTools tricks to improve your site's experience. And I see you've managed to share your screen here, so it's like the technical issues we were having before are resolved. You can go ahead and take it away, Bryce.
All right. Well, thank you. Uh, Hoping everybody can hear me okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Awesome. All right. Well, and we've got slides, but they're probably really small. So everybody might want to make those bigger. I'm not the important part. The slides are the big deal. Uh, anyway, we've got kind of a short amount of time here, so I'm not going to cover a lot of the why for the things I talk about. It's going to be more of the how. And to do that, let's just kind of get started by saying that in general, I kind of have this goal in life, and that is to get rid of the UX team. Now, when I say that, I don't mean my goal is to fire the interaction designers and to fire the UI people or to get rid of research and things like that. It's just more along the lines of the fact that the way traditional UX teams are set up, they're actually kind of being asked to do an impossible thing. Most teams are set up in such a way that they assume that UX or interface is really the entire experience, and I don't think that's the case. It's not doable for one team to create the entire experience across everything. Instead, I kind of think that it's the UX team's job to look at the user, understand the user, and then teach the rest of the organization how to understand them. Right? Basically, if we think about the way John Lennon did things, he said, love is all we need. I think that's probably true in a lot of cases, but in the case of UX, really, well, empathy is all we need. I'm sure you've heard this term thrown around, and some people kind of wonder what empathy really is. Well, I like to think of empathy as putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Now, when I say putting yourself in someone else's shoes, I don't mean, a new pair of shoes or thinking just, would I like that color on my feet? I mean, going to a secondhand store and buying a pair of shoes that somebody wore for 6 months or a year, right? The way that your foot fits in that shoe, maybe you borrow a set of cleats for a game, or you just, all of these things that there's an actual feeling of walking in someone else's shoes. This is what we mean by empathy. Kind of the cool thing, though, is that anybody can practice empathy. And when anybody can practice empathy, well, that's kind of a problem, right? Because that means that in general, UX becomes everybody's job. Now, I've been doing this kind of thing for a long time, and I kind of realized that technical architecture decisions have just as big an impact on the UX of a web app or a website as does the flows and the paths that people go through or the interface and how it looks. If you don't believe me, think about something like a loading bar that displays when the hardware that you're using can't keep up. What about things like network errors because there was no fallback infrastructure in place? We're taking this into more theoretical. Search results don't show up because the data structure or the data model was different than we expected. Maybe poorly trained machine learning produces unexpected results for the user. I mean, these are all problem spaces in UX that the traditional UX team probably couldn't have done anything with. There's not enough context for somebody to recommend things work a certain way. So I didn't introduce myself when we started. I just jumped right in. The reason for that is that I have spent most of my life as a visual designer, a UI designer, and a coder. And I do, as part of that, I do a lot of UX reviews for people, third party to come in and look at the problems and things like that. And I realized that while I cover flows and interface and things like that, there's a lot of technical friction that I uncover that really it feels different from the normal or UX process. So I'm here today to actually teach you, I'm assuming our audience is more technical, how to actually utilize tools that come with things we all have available and use those to start to understand the technical UX of the things we build. I said I was a coder. As a coder, I like my tools just as much as all of the rest of you do. There's always the fun of finding a new tool and figuring out how to use it and figuring out why to use it and when to use it. Well, the Chrome dev team, they like their tools just as much as the rest of us do. In fact, they've built a whole bunch of really cool UX process tools right into Chrome in the Chrome DevTools. So let's see how we use those. I had an invisible friend growing up. I think most of us did. And I realized that having this invisible friend that I would talk about as if they were a real person really set me up well to start to empathize with my users. When we're talking about technical UX, let's talk about the devices that users use, right? Users have a whole bunch of different devices in their lives. Your web app, your website, whatever could display across many of them. In fact, as scary as it sounds, we don't really need that many devices to sort of understand the experience that our users are having. Browser Stack is a couple of years old in 2019, but they said that really just 5 devices are all that's required to get 93% coverage of iOS, 76% coverage of Android, and then that's like 44% of mobile device sizes right there. The cool thing is if you add in iPads, minis, pros, etc., that gets us up to 78% of device sizes that your users might be using. I know you're thinking, okay, great. I came to a talk about Chrome DevTools and UX, and all of a sudden you're talking about things that our QA team typically handles. And they have physical devices or they have a Browser Stack subscription, and those are all things that I don't use day to day. Lucky for us, Chrome DevTools actually allows us to emulate different devices. You'll see there's a little icon. It typically sits right next to the Elements tab. That if you click on that, it actually changes your browser view to emulate a mobile device. So on the left, we have the desktop version of Google's Squoosh app. And on the right, we have the iPhone 8 version. Now, this isn't exactly an iPhone 8 like you get with Browser Stack or a real device, but very often it's not the device capabilities themselves that cause issues for users. It's the way things, it's the scale of things, it's how they lay out. It's the fact that your media queries maybe expected something that didn't show up and render quite the same way that you thought it would. Chrome does do a few things, right? It enables touch emulation, so you can drag and swipe. Granted, you have to drag and swipe with your mouse, unless you have a touchpad that allows that. So it's not exactly a one-to-one, but you start to understand how things work. Additionally, you've got some really cool tools where you can emulate walking through a canyon with no network signal. How does your app respond in those cases? If you created a progressive web app that has offline storage capabilities, what does it do? How do you inform the user that that happened? All that kind of stuff is kind of baked into this view. Now, anybody who was paying attention probably noticed that I suggested 5 devices. There are not those same 5 devices in this list of available devices. Lucky for us, see that little edit button down at the bottom? Chrome gave us a way to add whatever we wanted. So with a little bit of Googling, I can find out that the Galaxy S9, one of the devices that I was looking at, has a 1440 by 2960 resolution display, and it's got a 4x pixel multiplier to get the actual pixel screen depth to match the dimensions. I can create one like that, and away we go. Right, we get a faked Galaxy S9 that we can suddenly use to test all of our stuff. And when I say test, I really mean look at your site and understand that this is the experience that someone using this device is likely to get. Okay. In addition to devices, DevTools gives us some really cool abilities to understand things like performance. Now, obviously, the stuff we're talking about typically falls into the realm of the UX team. If you need rationale for why you're looking at this, you can tell your boss or your team that, oh, by the way, websites that don't hit a performance standard are actually decreased in search rankings. All right, so Google is paying attention to this. The reason Google is giving you these tools to get better at it is because they want your site to rank higher, but they're not going to do it unless you give them the stuff to work with. All right. I'm guessing most of you have seen this tab. It's called Lighthouse. It lives inside of DevTools. And inside of DevTools, you can find out some pretty cool stuff. You can use Lighthouse to run performance testing. You can find out about progressive web app best practices, for example, or whether your site meets the criteria of being called a progressive web app. You can see some actual overall best practices. You can see some accessibility, SEO, context, things like that. Now, Lighthouse in and of itself could be an entire talk. We're going to focus just on performance right now. And performance is actually pretty straightforward. It has a lot to do with how fast something loads. I took a look at Facebook's desktop and mobile web app. I wanted to see how it performed, basically because I assume that Facebook is going to deprioritize its web version in favor of the installable app. Surprisingly, it actually did pretty good, right? Now, granted, there's not a lot of stuff on this screen. There's a Facebook logo behind my DevTools panel, and there's a login. But that's pretty good. It got everything on the screen in just under a second. And the time that it took to be interactive, which means basically that I can click on the login button or put in my username and password, is 1.9 seconds. This is actually really good because the number you're looking for is 3 seconds. Most research shows that 3 seconds really is a magic number and that most users are going to dump and walk away after that. So this is giving you that. Everything you need is on that screen. Additionally, Lighthouse gives you some really cool opportunities and diagnostics. So you can pay attention to how changing your code might actually improve or negatively impact the user experience of something. One of my favorite ones to look at is render blocking resources. Are you loading huge JavaScript libraries that you don't need, which causes the browser threads to block an image that the user does want to see? You can start to kind of deduce all these questions that you might have from the Lighthouse report and scores. All right. So performance is a big picture piece. What does performance mean when we talk about it in my actual experience with the device? I mean, I hate janky websites. I think most of us do. My definition of a janky website is when stuff on the screen moves around in ways that I didn't expect it to. Frequently, we'll see this with, you're reading a news article or a blog post or something like that, something long form, and all of a sudden there's some really great advertising that's injected in the middle and it pushes everything else down further. You can also see this when web fonts load and replace system fonts, and the web fonts are different sizes so the paragraphs grow. Either way, that stuff's bad for the users and they hate it. And one other way that I experience janky websites, especially on mobile devices, is when I want things to move around on the screen, and some process causes them not to, right? So, for example, I swipe or I drag and scroll, and those are jittery and jumpy because there's not the processor can't handle that piece. Here's some examples of things moving around on a screen. The one on the left is kind of what I said with an ad or something jumping in. Notice in this case that if I was reading somewhere near the bottom of that green paragraph, it would have actually pushed the thing that I was trying to read off the screen. Now, that feels uncomfortable to me, and I think it would to most of us. The stuff on the right is actually a load time problem where things move around as they load. The cool thing about that is there's a real number and a real measurement for that. It's called cumulative layout shift. And what that means is as things push other things down on the screen, we can measure the percentage of that and add it up. So just out of curiosity, I thought I'd see how Home Depot's website loads on a mobile device. I was floored by these results. I was not expecting a number over 1 for a cumulative layout shift, or the fact that it took 10 seconds for basically the screen to load all the way. That's brutal. But there is something really cool here that DevTools is showing us, and that is visually, we can see exactly how the screens load, right? So it started out blank, and then it brought in these category icons, and then all of a sudden everything got shoved down when the big carousel piece loaded. That's not a great experience for users. Now, this is something that we can start to watch and pay attention to and maybe hopefully fix. Right about now, I'm guessing that you're saying, well, Bryce, that's great, but that's at the load time. Yeah, it took a long time to load, but people expect it to happen, and is it a big deal? Maybe not, right? But layouts move around after things have loaded too. For example, when you resize your browser window. Well, the cool thing is DevTools has a way for us to find that. Hidden deep down inside of Chrome's menus, or the DevTools menus, click on the little, the 3-dot hamburger menu, go to More Tools, and then there's this Rendering tab. The Rendering tab is going to give us all kinds of cool tools that we can use to see how other people might experience our site, or to see what happens and moves around that we maybe weren't expecting. For stuff that moves after the page is loaded, we can click this little Layout Shift Regions checkbox, and that'll show us that things like an accordion are pushing things around the screen. Now, with an accordion, if I click on it, I probably expected that to happen, as long as it was a clearly marked accordion. But think about when a browser window gets resized, or when that widget that you pull in from somewhere else loads and pushes something down the screen, or worse, when you inject something into the DOM. All of those cause stuff to move around and look janky. DevTools can also tell us if scrolling and dragging could be janky. It's marking things that could interact with the touch and drag callbacks, so that if there's a lot going on here, moving the site, like I am here with that kind of circular motion, could actually feel janky and broken. Great, cool stuff to pay attention to. Let's talk about something that doesn't seem technical at first, but I think as a technical person, most of us are very well placed to find this kind of thing. Something called accessibility. We have all heard the term, right? It's a facet of UX, but it's also often very hidden and very hard to understand how big a part of the population is really impacted by these things. So when I talk about accessibility on the web, I'm mostly talking about vision issues, dexterity issues, and sensory issues. When we talk about vision issues specifically, we do this binary thing, right? We say people with vision issues either use a screen reader or they can see my website just fine. What if that's not true? What if we started to pay attention to the parts of the population where this is a huge problem? So, for example, 1 out of every 12 men statistically experiences a color blindness issue. For you Canadians, that's 1.7 million of your countrymen. In the United States, that's 14.7 million Americans. Those are huge numbers, and they're not using a screen reader. They're just not seeing things the way we intended them to see them. So for an example of this, DevTools can actually show us, if you pick the emulate vision deficiencies and you select one of the color blindness types. This is red-green colorblind. This is the most common one. I'm going to run this against the University of Minnesota's Computer Science and Engineering webpage. They're a huge top 10 engineering school. I figure if anybody's going to have this stuff figured out, it's them, right? They get a ton of government money. Should be no problem. Well, let's look at the simulation. This is Chrome doing the simulation, by the way. The one on the left is no change, exactly as we expected it. The one on the right is what Chrome is simulating red-green colorblind people see when they look at this website. Now, if it was me and I was red-green colorblind and I was trying to find information, the fact that this stuff here suddenly doesn't look like a link, that's problematic for a lot of people and a lot of reasons. So I know what you're saying. Color blindness, okay, great. But that doesn't really, 4.5%, that's not a huge part of the population, even though it's maybe more than we think of. Well, what about some other vision issues that we might be talking about? For example, those people who just really don't want to go get eyeglasses. You have to go to the doctor, you have to get a prescription, you have to go try on lenses, you have to go do this whole long thing. Maybe I'll just live with it, right? DevTools lets us simulate that too. People who can't actually see the website as intended might see it in a blurry format. Same website, look at the problems we start to have with breadcrumbs. This site is almost unusable, and it didn't take a whole lot of vision issue for that to happen. These are things that I can't say what is right or wrong. You're going to actually have to look at these and use your intuition on them. But running a UX study that includes vision issues, for example, is a big deal. Lighthouse isn't done. Lighthouse will help us with this as well. But I should note that almost everything Lighthouse is checking for is how a screen reader would interact with this information. So the cool thing about the screen reader is that that actually has elements and things in our code that we can check against. So Lighthouse is giving Home Depot a pretty horrible score, actually, for visual impairment and accessibility. And it's showing all the things that you can do to correct that in the code to get a higher score. Doing those things then in turn help our users. Okay. There's a lot of stuff about vision in here, and I would highly suggest that you go through and try to understand how these interactions play out and use those tools in that render tab to help you with it. Let's look at something else, though. Do you know that 1 in 3 people experience motion sensitivity in their life? Now, you've probably heard of motion sensitivity as things like vertigo or nausea. We're not talking about Alfred Hitchcock movies. We're actually talking about something that really impacts the way your users look at your website or your web app. What's funny about this is that scientists actually don't think that it's a physiological issue, right? It's not a body thing. It's actually our brains are just deciding to put more emphasis on visual information for balance than the other senses, right? So we are saying the inner ear, for example, doesn't matter as much as what I see around me. Now, I'm guessing that you've seen people with this and may not have known it. So they're staring at their phone, they're trying to walk down the street, they're trying to chew bubble gum. We, as designers and developers, add in cool animations and things like that suddenly start to impact balance, right? What if somebody trips on a curb? Not because they weren't paying attention, but because we produced something that made them do that. Well, the cool thing is, again, DevTools lets us understand that. My favorite rendering tab, again, has this drop-down that says prefers reduced motion. Now, prefers reduced motion is a setting that anyone on a mobile device can pick at the OS level. Right? The browser doesn't necessarily know about it, other than the fact that it can tell you via a media query if this is something that the user is requesting. Now, if you're doing a UX audit, I always pop this open and check to see if anything changes. 99.9% of the time it doesn't. People aren't really thinking about this. But if it does change, this emulation will show you how the designer or developer, whoever made this, has it actually intended for it to change. So in this case, you see how the bouncing, springing box goes to more of a fade interaction when we simulate that. Good things to keep in mind and good things to call out if you see them not being addressed. All right, one more piece of accessibility that's really important. And that one more piece is what I refer to as dexterity issues. This can be a lot of things. I have family members who have shaky hands, right? Detail work is hard. And I watch them use a mobile device like this, right? They hold the device in one hand and then they try to tap things and move around. We've all been taught that everybody just, swipes with their thumbs and away we go. And that's not really the case. So to account for that, we need to make sure things are the right sizes and they have enough space around them that's not interactive so that somebody who's interacting in that way can actually use your website. Most of us have probably hit a button we didn't intend to on a website or in an app. It brought us to an unexpected place. This is the definition of a bad UX experience. So if, as we're going through, we can look at our code and say, well, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, recommends that there's be 44 by 44 device pixels for hit area. Okay, cool. Well, in this case, DevTools showing us the device. It's taking into account the pixel depth and sizing and showing us that on the computed tab here, we have a 2-pixel border, 16 pixels of padding, and an auto-sized element. Well, that doesn't really help us because we've got a kiwi there that is unknown size. That's whatever the icon is. Well, the cool thing is if we select the element in DevTools, you'll actually see a measurement show up on the screen. Turns out this button at roughly 55 by 55 pixels is well within our expected interaction sizes. So you can kind of go through this and start to call out pieces that feel like they might not have enough hit area for the average user. All right. We've burned through a lot of stuff. I actually have a couple, hey, wait, there's more things that you can do with DevTools. You may have noticed that all of my screenshots have DevTools in dark mode. I love that interface feature. In fact, it's becoming so high demand that an awful lot of companies are building that into their, not just their software, but into operating systems and everything in general. Both iOS and Android let you pick that you want dark or light mode to be the default. Websites also let you pick, if you've set that via again, a media query. But my gut says that this is something that people are going to want so badly that very soon browsers are going to force compliance. Sort of like what happened when we didn't make responsive websites and the browser got to decide where things laid out on this tiny little screen. I think the same thing is going to happen with light and dark websites. Well, our nifty, I'm sorry, that is incredibly blurry on my screen. Our nifty little rendering select here lets us say that the user prefers a color scheme of light or dark. Just like the reduced motion, if nothing happens, you know that nobody's planned for it. I suggest that we start highlighting this issue so people do plan for it, so you can decide what the experience is, how contrast works, all that kind of stuff, without letting the browser make it up for you as it goes. I'm actually showing you an example here of a site that is made to change. Somewhat unexpectedly for me, the default here is the dark mode, and you can see that the media queries are actually overriding a whole bunch of colors when we pick the light mode. All right. There, I said it. Rainbows are evil. I was actually going to look for examples of websites with way too many colors. I found a couple. They all hurt my eyes, and I decided that they would probably hurt your eyes just as much. So we're not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to say that in general, a website should have 3 primary colors, and it should stick to those 3 primary colors. How do you measure that, though? Right? Are you going to open up your code and look for every single spot that has a different hex code and count them out? Probably not. What you can do, though, is something that is brand new in Chrome 86. You can enable in the Settings tab the CSS overview. It's actually really cool. It shows you a report of the colors that are used in the site. It shows you a report of the fonts that are used. It shows you CSS that is unused, which is actually helpful for many of us. And then it shows you all the different media queries that you have. I'm super excited about this as a way to not just audit the UX and the experience, but to come back and say, hey, we're not matching best practices. We're using too many colors. The colors we're using maybe don't have enough contrast with each other, so on and so forth. This is all stuff that was actually really hard to do until quite recently. And there were some plugins that did it and some things, but Chrome's putting this right into DevTools, and now we can all use it. All right. So let's recap here a little bit. Number one takeaway that I hope you understand from this is that I truly, honestly believe that UX is literally everyone's job. Understanding how a user feels when they interact with your website shouldn't matter if your job title is UX. It shouldn't matter if your job title is in technology. It shouldn't matter if your job title is in QA or even customer support. You're all going to have a different perspective and a different way of empathizing with your users. And I want us all to identify that. Second, DevTools does a really good job of letting us emulate how our users see things on different devices. Put that into your toolbox, use it, it's great. Faster is better. I think we've covered that. Remember the 3-second rule, and keep Google and your users happy. Just say no to janky websites. Really, seriously, life is too short for janky websites. Please, please, please help me improve this experience for everybody across the board. And then, users are not optimal. We try to build for this ideal that actually isn't a very large portion of the population. And when we do that, we miss out on the experience for people with vision deficiencies or motion sensitivity and things like that. I said it. Dark is good. Rainbows are bad. You may not agree with me, but at least now you have the tools to look at those things and see, really, what does this mean? Do they work? Do they not work? Do I enjoy using the site that I built or not? All of these things actually let you make the case to the product or creative side of your organization that might say that technology is not the place that's supposed to be experiencing UX questions. Show them that these tools exist and show them that there are ways to make sure that the whole process matches, right? So from creative and interaction and research all the way through whether the database call is optimized and whether the screen paints in an optimal amount of time. That's everything I've got. Do we have any questions?
So it does look like we got a couple questions here. I'll start from the top. Don Ward asked, what's the best site you've seen for accessibility from Lighthouse or any other tools?
The best site I've seen is in other third-party sites that don't.
I believe I believe that's the context.
GreatNorthFS.com. Yes, Don, that is exactly what I was expecting. You know what? I didn't run it on there. Maybe I should have. This is a sad answer for me, actually. I see most every website failing at this horribly, including most of the ones I built. It was a wake-up call for me to start using these DevTools pieces and finding out how bad the stuff I make is. It's really painful. Oddly, places that get government money in the United States tend to be better at this. So hospitals, government websites, things like that tend to be better just because they can get dinged and their budgets can go away if they don't have it. But in general, this is a bad state, and we're actively destroying the user experience of the things we make for this part of the population.
Well, it's obviously really important that we get accessibility in as much as we can, so that as many people as possible can use all of our stuff. But also that when they do that, it doesn't run extremely poorly as well. Chris, hold on a second here. I just dropped out of the chat. There we go. Christopher asked, he doesn't see the CSS overview tab in his developer tools. Did it move, or is that?
So it is brand new in Chrome 86, which is the current shipping version. You have to open settings. And then inside of settings, there's experimental features, I think, or something along that terminology. Inside of that is a checkbox that says show CSS overview.
Yeah, settings, experiments, and then there's just a check for.
They are hiding this from you. I don't know why. You have to go hunting for it. And then once you do that, I think you actually have to reload DevTools and it'll show up.
Oh yeah, there it is. I got it.
So yes, I don't know why it's hidden. It's super cool, and I wish they wouldn't hide it because I think it's useful.
I assume it's something they're working on, and it'll probably get implemented. It does look pretty dense. It's yeah,
there's a lot going on there.
Yeah. Okay. And we've got another question here from Christophe. I hope I'm saying that correct. Material Design also recommends 3 main colors. It gives some leeway though, and suggests it's fine to use different 3 color patterns in different parts of the web app/web app. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I would agree with that, and I don't think think about the user, right? Think about the user experience. In general, if I go from one section to another section and the colors are different, that's probably okay. That's probably not gonna be that jarring. I'm more responding to the literal rainbow puke of colors that are used on some websites. Something that you should actually keep in mind here is that advertising can create this extra amount of color content that you weren't planning on, right? It's dynamic, and the ad company gets to inject whatever they feel like there. So that can actually add to it. But I would ask you to think about your experience when you see these sites that have more than 3 primary colors, let's say on the same page, right? What's your experience? They feel cheap. They feel like people didn't pay attention to it and didn't care that much. So much of UX is the way it makes me feel. That's kind of where that rationale for 3 primary colors comes from.
I think it's also important to note that when you're looking at design guidelines, it isn't like a strict rule set on how to design. Like this is exactly how your app should be designed. You can play with how
I
you.
actually have an answer for that.
Oh yeah.
Um, so I have a graphic design background. I went to art school for graphic design. And we were always told, this was kind of the mantra of the program, was that you need to know the rules before you can break them, right? I think I would take that a step further. You don't need to just know the rules. You need to know why the rules exist. Once you know that, and you can say, hey, I'm breaking the rule for this very specific reason, right? The section on my website picks a different color because it needed to be different from the section you just came from visually. Great, that works. You can use that as a reason. So kind of take design standards and guidelines as standards and guidelines. Get to the point where you're following them and then understand why you're breaking them if you're going to break them.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Um, unless there are any other questions or anything else, I think that is all we've got. Is there anything else you want to plug or I see you're at Howitson up here. I assume that's your Twitter.
That is Twitter. Feel free to follow me. I'm not super duper active, but if you ask questions or things like that, I'm a Google developer expert for web. I can get you in front of some people for things like, hey, I love this Chrome DevTools feature, but it's hidden and nobody can find it. I'll pass that stuff on happily. Otherwise, the only real plug is just that I have decided that my life exists to make all of these things better and nicer and smoother. And I hope that a lot of us are thinking about those things too, even if our job title isn't UX.
Well, that's fantastic to hear, and I'm excited to see uh, any other presentations or any other information you're excited to share with the rest of us. Um, Coming up next at 2:45 is I think our final networking session. Um, Feel free to join in on that and on our sessions later on. And thank you very much, Bryce, for joining us and for your fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Take care, everyone.